Call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Raised to take a call in the budget debate. And third Southlander in a row feels particularly momentous. But I do, and I'm sure sole parents and children in care will be feeling quite proud and understanding their place in our society now, having been described as cost drivers in the government's budget. I would like to say that the Green Party's perspective on our society differs a little from seeing these people as cost drivers to the government. When an economy is not working for everyone, it's not working. And we've had many examples over the last few years and weeks that tell us clearly that our economy is not working. But I do want to firstly acknowledge the government, actually, for raising base benefit rates for people with children. And yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge this because the Green Party has been saying that these incomes needed to increase for well over a decade now, long actually before the national government came to power, because child poverty that we've been talking about was not created by this national government. It has existed for decades, going right back to the fourth Labour government. In question time today, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade said that they'd been changing lots of policies at our request. We appreciate that, but we can't take all the responsibility for the increase in base benefit rates because it wasn't just us alone. The advocacy of Every Child Counts, Child Poverty Action Group, Plunkett, UNICEF, Barnardo's, amongst many other community organisations, as well as course of Brian Bruce, Nigel Latter, and most prominently, probably, John Campbell. These groups and people have been working tirelessly for years now to help everyone in New Zealand to understand what child poverty looks and feels like. Because there is a big disconnect between our communities, and most people who are working hard on good incomes don't necessarily get to see that real impact and didn't before understand the generational consequences of it. So I do really want to acknowledge them and the people of New Zealand who made sure the government knew that they weren't happy with so many of our children suffering and dying because of government policies. The National Party certainly seems very pleased that they've introduced this policy, and they should. But they are, I've got to say, it's kind of their pleasure does seem to verge on crowing. And I'm not really sure that that's the way to show that you genuinely care about the well-being of our children. But the acknowledgement that poverty won't be solved without addressing income is critical. And the Green Party is really relieved to finally have that acknowledged. But in some ways, all of this is about the politics, because while we know that the $25 a week, some people will get that, many won't get that much. And the degree of poverty in this country of 250,000 children in poverty and 60 to 100,000 in severe deprivation without beds of their own, without decent meals every day, without Christmas presents or birthday presents, without being able to afford to go to the doctor, without the transport to not being able to go on school trips. We know that that extra $25, even for those who get it, is not going to solve those problems. This is one step. This is not a solution, and sadly yet it's still not a plan. And we desperately, on behalf of those children, need to keep advocating for that plan to be able to give them the opportunity to live good lives. And I do just want to specifically acknowledge too that within this, that $25 increase doesn't compensate for the cuts to the child disability allowance, which is an allowance that isn't means tested. And since there have been very significant cuts since 2009, there are 11,000 fewer children accessing that child disability allowance. And that disability allowance is worth $46.25 a week. So that's been a cut to 11,000 children of an amount that's significantly more than what the government is offering in this package. And that they are some of the children that are in the most need. And that those cuts have been made by the government not telling people about the available entitlements and by tightening up the entitlements. And there was a very moving article in the Herald at the end of last year talking about this and some of the examples, and one of the Wellington beneficiary advocates, Graham Howell, was saying one family with an intellectually disabled child or a child with a learning disability lost the child disability allowance when the boy grew old enough to tie his own shoelaces. And a child with eczema lost the allowance when the boy became able to put on his own ointment. That's the threshold where that access to that disability support for beneficiaries and working families has been put at such a level that I don't think any of us can understand. And I do think there was an Onehunga mother, Emma Rose Cottrell, who was quoted in that article, and her husband works part-time and she's full-time caring, and her husband's only able to work part-time because they just wouldn't cope as a family. And she said, and this is quoting her, referring to her husband, he's not allowed to do full-time, otherwise I'd die of stress, unquote. She said, I have to do naps most days because I'm just so exhausted, unquote. This is the reality for some of our families, and I really want to focus the House's attention on the fact that that was a two-parent family. And she's talking about that level of exhaustion where she's sharing the care for their child with a partner. And now to put that in focus around the increased work testing for sole parents that was also contained in this budget. That for children, parents, when their child turns 3, regardless of whether their child has disability or special emotional needs, regardless of what trauma that family may have been through, that family is now parent is going to be required to go and look for 20 hours work. And remember, this is a story of a woman with a partner who's in work, who is saying she could not cope without her partner being at home with her to care for her child, because it would just be too physically and emotionally demanding. We need desperately to be supporting our families better and acknowledging the different struggles that our families are coping with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that one-size-fits-all policies like this are likely to do so much more harm. Sure, some families, some parents, some mothers, it's going to suit them to be able to go out to work and find a job if they can find one. Though we were also hearing from Dr. Nikki Turner at the Child Poverty Action Breakfast that she's seeing parents going out to work and the only jobs they're able to get are evening or night jobs, and they're leaving their kids at home alone because of that requirement and that pressure to be in work. Is that really what we want for our children? Is that really in the best interest of our society in the long term? I would say very clearly it's not. The Green Party advocates for child-centred policies where we consider the interests of the child first, and that they will be different for every single child, and that we support families to be able to do what is best for their children. And that, sadly, is not a blanket 20 hours a week from age 3 work test requirement for parents, regardless of the needs of their children. And I know I don't have much time, but I do want to specifically also touch on the, because the Speaker told us this was the space to do it, on the funding decision around Relationships Aotearoa. The largest counselling organisation in this country with 7,000 clients that's been in existence since 1949 to be closing their doors this week without a publicly available transition plan for their clients is an outrage.